Well, welcome back again, y'all. Glad to see you here around this campfire. Man, the weather's changed. It's gotten pretty cold here in the west. We're sitting around the campfire and really enjoying the warmth. Got something warm in my mug too, and that's going to help. Well, as you know, we're reading a good story about. It's called The Untamed, written by Max Brand, probably 100 years ago. But it's still a pretty good adventure, and we've read you through chapter 14 already, and figuring I'm going to start with chapter 15 again tonight, and read you a couple, 3 or 4 more, and we'll do the same. We're getting there. We're about over halfway through, so I hope you enjoy these. So this is chapter 15, The Crossroads. As Black Bart raced away to answer to Dan's whistle, Kate recovered herself from the daze in which she stood. With a sob ran towards the willows, calling the name of Dan, but Silent sprang after her and caught her by the arm. She cried out and struggled vainly in his grip. "Don't follow him, boys," called Silent. "He's a dog that can bite while he runs. Stand quiet, girl." Lee Haines caught him by the shoulder and jerked Silent around. His hand held the butt of his revolver, and his whole arm trembled with eagerness for the draw. "Take your hand from her, Jim," he said. Silent met his eye with the same glare, and while his left hand still held Kate by both her wrists, his right dropped to his gun. "Not when you tell me, Lee. Damn you, I say let her go. By God, Haines, I stand for too much from you." And still they did not draw, because each of them knew that if the crisis came, it would mean death to them both. Bill Kilduff jumped between them and thrust them back. He cried, "Ain't we got enough trouble without rounding up work at home? Terry Jordan is shot through the arm." Kate tugged at the restraining hands of Silent, not in an attempt to escape, but in an order to get closer to Haines. "Was this your friendship," she said, her voice shaking with hate and sorrow, "to bring me here as a lure for Whistlin Dan? Listen to me, all of you. He escaped you now, and he'll come again. Remember him, for he shan't forget you." "You hear her?" said Silent to Haines. "Is this what you want me to turn loose?" "Silent," said Haines, "it isn't about the girl alone you've double-crossed." "Is this what you want me to turn loose?" "Silent," said Haines, "it isn't the girl alone you've double-crossed. You've crooked me, and you'll pay for it sooner or later. Day or night, winter or summer, I'm willing to meet you and fight it out. Reinhardt and Purvis, take this girl back to the clearing." They approached, Purvis still staring at the hand from which only a moment before his gun had been knocked by the shot of Whistlin Dan. It was a thing which he could not understand. He had not yet lost the most uncomfortable sense of awe. Haines made no objection when they went off, Kate walking between them. He knew now that his blind anger had left him, that it was folly to draw on a fight while the rest of Silent's men stood around him. "And the rest of you go back to the clearing. I got something to talk over with Lee," said Silent. The others obeyed without question, and the leader turned back to his lieutenant. For a moment longer they remained staring at each other. Then Silent slowly moved forward with outstretched hand. "Lee," he said quietly, "I'm owing you an apology, and I'm man enough to make it." "I can't take your hand, Jim." Silent hesitated. "I guess you got cause to be mad, Lee," he said. "Maybe I played too quick a hand. I didn't think about double-crossing you. I only seen a way to get Whistlin Dan out of our path, and I took it without remembering that you was the safeguard to the girl." Haines eyed his chief narrowly. "I wish to God I could read your mind," he said at last. "But I'll take your word that you did it without thinking." His hand slowly met Silent's. "And what about the girl now, Lee?" "Well, I'll send her back to her father's ranch. It'll be easy to put her on the right way." "Don't you see no reason why we can't do that? Are you playing with me? I'm talking to you as I'd talk to myself. If she's loose, she'll describe us all and set the whole range on our trail." Haines stared. Silent went on, "If we can't turn her loose, there's only one thing left, and that's to take her with us wherever we go." On your honor, do you see no other way out? Do you? She may promise not to speak of it. There ain't no way of changing the spots of a leopard, Lee, and there ain't no way of keeping a woman's tongue still. Well, how can we take the girl with us? It ain't gonna be for long. After we pull the job that comes on the 18th, we'll blow farther south, and then we'll let her go. And no harm will come to her while she's with us? Here's my hand on it, Lee. Now how can she ride with us? She won't go as a woman. I've thought of that. I brought out a new outfit for Purvis from Elkhead. Trousers, chaps, shirts, and all. He's small. They'll near fit the girl. There isn't any other way, Jim? I leave it to you. God knows I don't want to drag any damn calico around with us. As they went back towards their clearing, they'd arranged the details. Silent would take the men aside and explain his purpose to them. Haynes could inform the girl of what she must do. And just before they reached the camp, Silent stopped short, took Haynes by the shoulder. There's only one thing I can't make out, Lee. And that's how Whistlin Dan made his getaway. I'd have bet 1,000 bones that he would be dropped before he could touch his shooting irons. And then what happened? Hal Purvis just flashed a gun and that feller shot it out of his hand. I ain't never seen a draw like that. His hand just seemed to twitch, and I couldn't follow the move he made. And the next second his gun went off. He stared at Lee with a sort of fascinated horror. Silent, said Haynes. Can you explain how the lightning comes down out of the sky? Of course not. Then don't ask me to explain how Whistlin Dan made his getaway. One minute I hear him talking to the girl. The next second there are 2 shots. And when I whirled, he was gone. But he'll come back, Jim. We're not through with him. He slipped away from you and your men like water out of a sieve. But we won't slip away from him the same way. Silent stared on again with bowed head. He likes the girl, Lee. Anyone can see that. Then while she's with us, he'll go pretty slow, Lee. That's another reason why she's got to stay with us. My friend, it's time we was moving out from the willows. The next time he comes up with us, he won't be numb in the head. He'll be thinking fast, and he'll be shooting a damn sight faster. We got 2 jobs ahead of us. First, to get that Wells Fargo shipment, and then to get to Whistlin Dan. There ain't room enough in this whole world for him and me. Now this is chapter 16, just the 3 of us. In the clearing of Whistlin Dan's and Tex Calder's, the marshal had turned into his blankets once more. There was no thought of sleep in Dan's mind. When the heavy breathing of the sleeper began, he rose, and he commenced to pace up and down on the farther side of the open space. 2 pairs of glowing eyes followed him in his every move. Black Bart, who trailed him up and down during the first few turns he made, now sat down and watched his master with a wistful gaze. And then the black stallion, who lay more like a dog than a horse on the ground, kept his ears pricked forward as if expecting some order. Once or twice he whinnied very softly, and finally Dan sat down beside Satan. His shoulders leaned against the satiny side, and his arms flung out along the stallion's back. Several times he felt hot breath against his cheek as the horse turned a curious head toward him. But he paid no attention, even when the stallion whinnied a question in his ear, for in his heart was numb. It was a strange feeling that made him weak. He was even blind to the fact that Black Bart at last slipped into the shadows of the willows. Presently something cold touched his chin. He found himself staring into the yellow-green eyes of Black Bart, who panted from his run, and now dropped from his mouth something in which fell into Dan's lap. It was the glove of Kate Cumberland. In the grasp of his long, nervous fingers, how small it was, and yet the hand which had wrinkled the leather was strong enough to hold the heart of a man. He slipped and caught the shaggy black head of Bart between his hands. The wolf knew. In some mysterious way, he knew. The touch of sympathy unnerved him. All his sorrow and his weakness burst on his soul in a single wave. A big tear struck the shining nose of the wolf. "Bart," he whispered, "did you figure on plumb busting my heart, pal?" To avoid those large, melancholy eyes, Bart pressed his head inside of his master's arm. "Delilah," whispered Dan. After that, not a sound came from the three, the horse, the dog, or the man. Black Bart curled up at the feet of his master and seemed to sleep, but every now and then an ear raised or an eye twitched open. He was on guard against a danger which he did not understand. The horse also, with a high head, scanned the circling willows, alert. But the man, for whom the stallion and the wolf watched, gave no heed to either. There was a vacant and dreamy expression in his eye, as if he was searching his own inner heart and found out the greatest enemy of all. All night they sat in this manner, silent, moveless, the animals watching against the world, the man watching against himself. Before dawn he roused himself suddenly, crossed to the sleeping marshal and touched him on the arm. "It's time we hit the trail," he said as Calder sat up in his blanket. "What's happened? Isn't it our job to comb the willows?" "Silent ain't in the willows." Calder started to his feet. "How do you know that?" "They ain't close to us, that's all I know." Tex smiled incredulously. "I suppose," he said good-humoredly, "that your instinct brought you this message." "Instinct?" repeated Dan blankly. "I don't know." Calder grew serious. "We'll take a chance that you may be right. At least we can ride down the riverbank and see if there's any fresh tracks in the sand. If Silent had started this morning, I have an idea he'll head across the river and line out for the railroad." In 20 minutes their breakfast was eaten and they were in the saddle. The sun had not yet risen when they came out of the willows to the broad, shallow basin of the river. In spring, when the snow of the mountains melted, that river filled from bank to bank with a yellow torrent. At the dry season of the year, it was just a dirty little creek meandering through the sands. Down the bank they rode at a sharp trot for a mile and a half, until Black Bart, who scouted ahead of them at his gliding wolf trot, came to an abrupt stop. Dan spoke to Satan. The stallion broke into a swift gallop, which left the pony of Tex Calder laboring in the rear. When he drew rein beside the wolf, they found 7 distinct tracks of horses which went down the bank of the river, crossed the basin. Calder turned with a wide-eyed amazement to Dan. "God, you're right again," he said, not without a touch of vexation in his voice. "But the dog stopped at these tracks. How does he know you were hunting for Silent's crew?" "I don't know," said Dan. "Maybe he just suspects." "They can't have a long start of us," said Calder. "Let's hit the trail. We'll get them before night." "No," said Dan, "we won't." "Why won't we?" "I've seen Silent's hoss, and I've ridden him. If the rest of his gang have the same kind of hoss flesh, you can never catch him with that cayuse of yours." "Oh, maybe not today," said Calder, "but in 2 days we'll run him down. 7 horses can't travel as 2 in a long chase." They started out across the basin, keeping to the tracks of Silent's horses. It was the marshal's idea that the outlaws would head on a fairly straight line for the railroad, and accordingly, when they lost the track of the 7 horses, they kept to this direction. Twice during the day, they verified their course by information received, once from a range rider and once from a man in a dusty buckboard. Both of these had sighted the fast-traveling band, but each had seen it pass an hour or 2 before Calder and Dan arrived. Such tidings encouraged the marshal to keep his horse at an increasing speed, but in the middle of the afternoon, though Black Satan showed little or no signs of fatigue, the cattle pony was nearly blown and they were forced to reduce their pace to the ordinary dog trot. This is Chapter 17, The Panther's Paw. Evening came and they still had not sighted the outlaws. As darkness fell, they drew near a house snuggled away among a group of cottonwoods. Here they determined to spend the night, for Calder's pony was now almost exhausted. A man of 50 came from the house in answer to their call and showed the way to the horse shed. While they unsaddled their horses, he told them that his name was Sam Daniels. Yet he evinced no curiosity as to the identity of his guests, and they volunteered no information. His eyes lingered long and fondly over the exquisite lines of Satan. From behind, from the side, and in front he viewed that stallion, while Dan rubbed down the legs of his mount with care, which was most foreign to the ranges. Finally the cattleman reached out a hand towards that smoothly muscled shoulder. It was Calder who stood nearest and managed to strike up Daniel's extended arm and jerk him back from the region of danger. "What in the hell's that for?" exclaimed Daniels. "That horse is called Satan," said Calder, "and when anyone, save his owner, touches him, he lives up to his name and raises hell." Before Daniels could answer, the light of the lantern fell upon Black Bart, previously half hidden by the deepening shadows of the night, but standing now at the entrance of the shed. The cattleman's teeth clicked together, and he slapped his hand against his thigh and reached for a gun, which was not there. "Look behind you," he said to Calder. "A wolf!" He made a grab for the marshal's gun, but the latter forestalled him. "Go easy, partner," he said, grinning. "That's only the running mate of the horse. He's not a wolf, at least not according to his owner. And as for being wild, look at that." Bart had stalked calmly into the shed and now lay curled up exactly beneath the feet of the stallion. The two guests received a warmer welcome from Sam Daniels' wife when they reached the house. Their son, Buck, had been expected home for supper, but it was too late for them to delay the meal longer. Accordingly, they sat down at once, and the dinner was nearly over when Buck, having announced himself with a whoop as he rode up, entered, banging the door loudly behind him. He greeted the strangers with a careless wave of his hand and sat down at the table. His mother placed some food silently before him. No explanation of his tardiness were asked, and none was offered. The attitude of his father indicated clearly that the boy had represented the earning power in the family. He was a big feller with broad, thick wrists and straight black eye. When he had eaten, he broke into breezy conversation, and especially of a vicious mustang he had ridden on a bet the day before. "Speaking of hosses, Buck," said his father, "they's a black one out in the shed right now that'd make your eyes just naturally pop out in the sockets. No more than 15 hands, but a regular picture. Must be grease lightning." "I've heard talks of those streaks of grease lightning," said Buck with a touch of scorn, "but I'll stack old Mike agin the best of 'em. And there's a dog along with the hoss, a dog that's the nearest to a wolf of any I ever seen." There was a sudden change in Buck, a change to be sensed rather than definitely noted with the eye. It was a stiffening of his body, an alertness of which he was at pains to make no show, for almost immediately he began to whistle softly, idly, his eyes roving carelessly across the walls while he tilted back in his chair. Dan dropped his hand down close to the butt of his gun. Instantly the eyes of Buck flashed down and centered on Dan for an instant of keen scrutiny. Certainly Buck had connected the mention of the black horse and the wolf dog with the disturbing idea. When they went to their room, a room in which there was no bed, and they had to roll down their blankets on the floor, Dan opened the window and commenced to whistle one of his own wild tunes. It seemed to Calder that there was a break in that music here and there, and a few notes grouped together like a call. In a moment, a shadowy figure leaped through the window, and Black Bart landed on the floor with soft padding feet. Recovering from his start, Calder cursed softly. "What's the main idea?" he asked. Dan made a signal for a lower voice. "There ain't no idea," he answered. "But these Daniel people, do you know anything about 'em?" "No, why?" "Yeah, they interest me, that's all." "Anything wrong?" "Yeah, I guess not." "Then why'd you whistle for this infernal wolf? It makes me nervous to have him around. Get out, Bart." The wolf turned a languid eye upon the marshal. "Let him be," said Dan. "I don't feel no ways natural without having Bart around." The marshal made no further objections, and having rolled himself in his blanket, was almost immediately asleep and breathing heavily. The moment Dan heard his companion draw breath with a telltale regularity, he sat up again in his blankets. Bart was instantly at his side. He patted the shaggy head lightly and pointed towards the door. "Guard," he whispered. Then he lay down and was immediately asleep. Bart crouched at his feet, with his head pointed towards the door. In other rooms there was the sound of the Daniels family going to bed. Noises distinctly heard throughout the flimsy frame of the house. After that, a dark silence fell which lasted many hours. But in that darkest moment, which just precedes the dawn, a light creaking came up the hall. It was very faint. It occurred only at long intervals. But at the very first sound, Black Bart raised his head from his paws and stared at the door with those glowing eyes which see in the dark. Now another sound came, still soft and regular. There was a movement of the door. In the pitch dark, a man could never have noticed it, but it was plainly visible to the wolf. Still more visible, when the door finally stood wide, was the form of the man who stood in the opening. In one hand he carried a lantern, thoroughly hooded, but not so well wrapped that it kept back a single ray which flashed on the revolver. The intruder made a step forward, a step as light as the fall of feathers, but it was not half so stealthy as the movement of Black Bart, as he slunk towards the door. He had been warned to watch the door, but it did not need a warning to tell him that the danger was approaching his sleeping master. In the crouched form of the man, in the cautious step, he recognized the unmistakable stalking of one who hunts. Another soft step the man made forward. Then, with appalling suddenness, a blacker shadow shot up from the deep night of the floor, and white teeth gleamed before the stranger's face. He threw up his hand to save his throat. The teeth sank into his arm. A driving weight hurled him against the wall, then to the floor. The revolver and the lantern dropped clattering, and the latter, rolling from its wrapping, flooded the room with light, but neither man nor wolf uttered a sound. Calder was standing, gun in hand, but too bewildered to act, while Dan, as if he were playing a part long rehearsed, stood, covering the fallen form of Buck Daniels. "Stand back from him, Bart," he commanded. The wolf slipped off a pace, whining with horrible eagerness, for he'd just tasted blood. Far away, a shout came from Sam Daniels. Dan lowered his gun. "Stand up," he ordered. The big fellow picked himself up and stood against the wall with blood streaming down his right arm. Still he said nothing, and his keen eyes darted from Calder to Whistlin Dan. "Give me a strip of that old shirt over there, will you, Tex?" said Dan, "and keep him covered while I tie up his arm." Before Calder could move, old Daniels appeared at the door, a heavy Colt in his hand. For a moment he stood dumbfounded. But then, with a cry, he jerked up his gun, a quick movement, but a fraction of a second too slow, for the hand of Dan darted out and his knuckles struck the wrist of the old cattleman. The Colt rattled on the floor. He lunged after his weapon, but the voice of Buck stopped him short. "The game's up, Dad," he growled. "That older feller is Tex Calder." The name, like a blow in the face, straightened old Daniels and left him white and blinking. Whistlin Dan turned his back on the father and deftly bound up the lacerated arm of Buck. "In the name of God, Buck," moaned Sam, "what you been trying to do in here?" "What you'd do if you had the guts for it. That there's Tex Calder and this here's Dan Barry. They're on the trail of Big Jim. I wanted to put 'em off that trail." "Look here," said Calder, "how'd you know us?" "I've said my little say," said Buck sullenly, "and you'll get no more out of me between here and any hell you can take me to." "He knew us when his father talked about Satan and Black Bart," said Dan to Tex. "Maybe he's one of Silence." "Buck, for God's sake, tell him you know nothing of Silent," cried old Daniels. Boy, it's hanging for you if they get you to Elkhead and charge you with that." "Dad, you're a fool," said Buck. "I ain't going down on my knees to them. Not me." Calder, still keeping Buck covered with his gun, drew Dan a little to one side. "What can we do with this fella, Dan?" he said. "Shall we give up the trail and take him over to Elkhead and break the heart of the old man? Buck is one of the gang, that's certain. Get Silent and there won't be no gang left. But we caught this chap in red blood. He ain't very old, Tex. Maybe he could change. I think he ain't been playing Silence game any too long. We can't let him go. It isn't in reason to do that." "Well, I ain't thinking of reason. I'm thinking of old Sam and his wife. And if we turn him loose, he'll be your man till he dies." Calder scowled. "The whole range is filled with these silent partners of the outlaws. But maybe you're right, Dan. Look at them now." The father was standing close to his son and pouring out a torrent of appeal, evidently begging him in a low voice to disavow any knowledge of Silent and his crew. But Buck shook his head sullenly. He'd given up hope. Calder approached him. "Buck," he said, "I suppose you know that you could be hung for what you've tried to do tonight. If the law wouldn't hang you, a lynching party would. No jail would be strong enough to keep them away from you." Buck was silent, dogged. "But suppose we were to let you go scot-free?" Buck started. A great flush covered his face. "I'm taking the advice of Dan Barry in doing this," said Calder. "Barry thinks you could go straight. Tell me now, man to man, if I give you the chance, will you break loose from Silent and his gang?" A moment before, Buck had been steeled for the worst. But this sudden change loosened all the bonds of his pride. He stammered and he choked. Calder turned abruptly away. "Dan," he said, "here's the dawn, and it's time for us to hit the trail." They rolled their blankets hastily and broke away from the gratitude which pours like water from the heart of old Sam. They were in their saddles when Buck came beside Dan. His pride, his shame, and his gratitude broke his voice. "I ain't much on words," he said, "but it's you I'm thinking." His hand reached up hesitantly, and Dan caught it in a firm grip. "Why," he said gently, "even Satan here stumbles now and then, but that ain't no reason I should get rid of him. Good luck, partner." He took the reins, and the stallion leaped off after Calder's trotting pony. Buck Daniels stood motionless looking after him, and his eyes were very dim. For an hour, Dan and Tex were on the road before the sun looked over the hills. Calder halted his horse to watch. "Dan," he said at last, "I used to think there were only two ways of handling men. One with the velvet touch and one with the touch of steel. Mine has always been the way of steel. But I begin to see there's a third possibility, the touch of the panther's paw. The velvet with the steel claws hid beneath. That's your way, and I wonder if it isn't the best. I think Buck Daniels would be glad to die for you." He turned directly to Dan. "But all this is aside from the point, which is that the whole country is full of these silent partners of the outlaws. The law plays a lone hand in the mountain desert." "You've played the lone hand and won 20 times, said Dan. "Aye, but the 21st time I may fail. The difference between success and failure in this country is just the length of time it takes to pull a trigger. And Silent, he's fast with a gun. He's the root of the outlaw power. We may kill 100 men, but till he's gone, we've only mowed the weeds, not pulled them. What's the use of talking? 1 second will tell the tale when I stand face to face with Jim Silent and we go for our 6 guns. And somewhere between the rising sun and those mountains, I'll find Jim Silent and the end of things for one of us." He started his cattle pony into a sudden gallop, and they drove on into the bright morning. Well, friends, that was another fun evening around the campfire, and I think I'm gonna go fill up my cup and get me some more of that chicory coffee. I sure am enjoying that. I don't know if y'all drink that, but you ought to give it a try. It's kind of smooth, and it's not quite as strong. Well, nonetheless, I'll talk to y'all next time I see you here around the campfire. Until then, this is Clay Steele. Have a great night.